Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this special PRCA Scotland event, a post-election analysis. For those of you that don't know me, my name's John Morrison. I'm the Scotland representative on the PRCA's Public Affairs Board and your host for the next hour. I'm delighted that we have an expert panel to answer your questions. Mandy Rhodes, give us a wave, Mandy, is the Managing Director of Holyrood and the editor of the flagship title Holyrood magazine. Nicola Sturgeon, no less, the First Minister of Scotland, has described her as one of the best interviewers in the business. Kirsty Peebles, give us a wave, Kirsty, is Managing Director of Newsdirect, the political monitoring company she founded in 1999. Specialising in the UK's devolved institutions, Newsdirect provides daily political monitoring to in-house PA teams, and very useful it is too, also to consultancies and campaign groups. And finally, Luke Skipper is Director of Public Affairs in Scotland with Webber Shandwick, providing senior counsel to clients across a variety of sectors. Before joining Webber Shandwick, he worked in the Scottish, European and UK parliaments for the SNP, including serving as Chief of Staff to the party's Westminster group. So that's the introductions. For today, if you can send us in your questions through the chat function, and hopefully that will work effortlessly. And if you send me your questions, please add your name as well so that we can identify who the question is coming from. And I think I'll just get it underway because I don't know if any of you noticed that I was doing a bit of tweeting about this. And I sent out a tweet saying, what are the priorities of the Scottish Parliament now that we know the Cabinet for the next 5 years? And a friend private messaged me 3 words: independence, independence, independence. So is that the priority? Mandy, we'll start with you.
Well, it shouldn't be the priority, should it? But I think even given the election result, we know that independence matters. Even when things like education, COVID, drug deaths, the economy are all not showing a very good record for this government, people clearly didn't include that in their voting priorities. So yes, the First Minister says serious leader for serious times and that COVID and the recovery is the most important thing, but the Constitution still dominates.
Luke, you've had 2 feet in that political camp. Independence, 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 or can they, as they say they will do, they can run the country at the same time?
I don't think it'll be an immediate priority, and the First Minister said as much in the run-up and during the election campaign that the independence referendum would be at a time at which, you know, the country had recovered from COVID in a health and economic sense. And I think it suits both the UK and the Scottish governments to have that focus on COVID recovery at the moment. It was interesting to see. I mean, you'd be forgiven in the immediate aftermath of the election and thinking perhaps that the SNP hadn't won a historic 4th term because there was so much focus on whether or not the party had achieved a mandate for independence. But quite quickly after that, and indeed probably on Sunday, the Sunday after, you saw from Michael Gove more nuanced position around whether or not the UK government would challenge anything in court. But the key lines that they were stepping back to is that recovery was the priority of the UK government. And as you'll see this week on Thursday, for example, this is the summit between the leaders of the devolved nations and Boris Johnson, in which they are going to see how they can work together to foster that aim. So I think it suits both groups in the short term, at least, to focus on COVID recovery, but certainly in the back half of the Parliament, I would see the independence coming to the fore.
Okay, and before I go to Kirsty, can I just remind you, please start firing in your questions. We've got 3 experts, and as you can hear, they're going to tell us everything they know about what's happening over the next 5 years. So how do you see the priorities lining up for the government, the Cabinet?
Yeah, it definitely, I mean, if while there's a sort of a stalemate on independence and the incoming government can sort of focus on those more immediate and domestic priorities, I think that actually suits the UK and the Scottish government. not least in Scotland. I think sort of kicking the referendum can slightly down the road places Scottish Labour in its same slightly awkward position. We know that Anna Sarwar is very good on sort of COVID recovery, and has a sort of certain he's possibly benefiting from the sort of perhaps the failures of his predecessor, and yet to be sort of proven in sort of leadership himself, given he's been in post for slightly too long. But for whether his stuff on sort of coming together over COVID chimes, for as long as that Indie Ref is in front of us, there is still a problem there, and it clearly will suit Nicola to time any referendum post the next UK general election, and what the result of that sort of says to a Scottish electorate. So there's a lot of things to juggle, but a lot of things domestically that clearly are just going to focus minds for the next years.
Mandy, I know from talking to you before we did this session, you've got a theory on this general election, UK general election.
I guess I think I'm just picking up on what Kirsty said. I'm not sure the decision about the referendum timing will lie with Nicola. And now that the fixed term Parliament has a big question mark over it, I can't imagine why Boris Johnson won't hold a general election before a referendum. He's also got a wedding to think about. Nicola had talked about the latter part of the session, which would take us to about 2023. I suggest he might think about a general election in 22, even next year maybe. And that they will go into that very clearly, saying that why are you sending SNP MPs to Westminster? Why would you want a second independence referendum? He'll also be looking for the economy to start recovering and be pointing out the benefits of being part of the UK, which I think is the case that has not yet been made. And that will start to ramp up, particularly with COP26 coming to Glasgow in November.
Okay, Luke, do you want to add anything before we go to the first question?
Yeah, I don't think that's an implausible scenario from Mandy. I'd also add that what's quite interesting post Brexit and the UK leaving the EU is some of the newfound freedoms available to the UK government in terms of direct spending in Scotland. So the levelling up agenda, you will have heard of that undoubtedly, but in the Scottish context, it has a different political element in the sense that they're able to circumvent the Scottish government and give funding direct to local councils. So if you consider the time frame that Mandy said there would be opportunities in the last 12 months of that, perhaps year and a half, that spending has actually started to take effect in different areas in Scotland. And I think that's sort of this muscular unionism that's talked about, and that could have a pretty significant impact on voting intentions in a run-up to a general election.
Okay, this one's, I'll start with you on this one, Kirsty. This is a question from Derek Young. Is the independence row destined for the courts? This has been suggested. If the government introduces a referendum bill in the second half of the Parliament with no Section 30 order post-COVID, it's certified as competent by the new presiding officer, and it's up to the Advocate General to challenge this before the Supreme Court. I'm not sure what would motivate either side to avoid this scenario. So do you think it'll end up in court? Kirsty first.
Oh, start with an easy one, huh? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon told her conference in 2019 that if they were to try and hold a referendum that wasn't recognised as legal or legitimate, it wouldn't carry the weight that was needed. It wouldn't be accepted sort of internationally, including by EU sort of friends and sort of partners. We've obviously sort of we've had a few kind of little sort of test cases sort of going through the Parliament, but it's the legal the legal route. It's just really unclear what the timescale of outcome of what that sort of challenge sort of would be. I'm not sure that ending up in the courts is ideal for either sort of side of the argument, and all we have is kind of a fairly sort of non-committal sort of comment from sort of UK government.
Okay, Mandy, do you see it happening that if they go and say, right, we're going to have the referendum, can you see the UK government going to court to stop the Scottish government doing that?
Possibly. I guess it's what Kirsty said, it's about the optics of that, but it's so complicated, I've written it down. So as Kirsty says, the SNP plan, and Nicola Sturgeon has always said, it would be a legal referendum. There's no suggestion of a wildcat referendum. So to do that, they request, obviously, I don't want to teach my granny to suck eggs here, but anyway, they would request a Section 30 order.
Who's the granny?
Yeah, from the UK government to devolve the powers necessary to let that vote happen. But Boris Johnson has said he wouldn't grant that. So if he does reject that, the Scottish government would still introduce the bill in the Parliament to make the necessary arrangements. So you'd then have the optics of the Scottish Parliament voting for this, UK government still voting it down. They could then take that to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court rules against them, against the UK government, the vote's legal and goes ahead. And if they do that and the Supreme Court rules in their favour, the vote is illegal and doesn't go ahead, but the UK government must then explain to the electorate and to the Scottish Parliament, which represents the electorate in Scotland, why they've decided to rule against them, which wouldn't look good for them. I think there was the other suggestion about could there be a Gina Miller type figure in the background to stop this? And I think that's been kiboshed as well. I mean, I guess my view is, yes, it will end up in the courts.
Okay. Luke, what do you reckon?
Not a lot more to add. I mean, the optics for both sides are very difficult. It's high risk, low reward. But in the context of a general election, it's being tested in the courts. Courts rule against. In theory, what is the route to Scotland having a legal and binding referendum? And that in and of itself is a powerful message to the supporters of independence about getting them out to vote as well. So it is very, very fraught. I think that we shouldn't exclude the potential of another test case, but you can't stop individuals from doing that. But yeah, it's very difficult to predict. And I would think though that they would be loath to start this process in the next 12 months to 18 months. I mean, I think that the laying of the bill in Parliament will be important to supporters of independence. And then at that sort of second, third stage of that process, bill going through Parliament, you might start to see these questions come to the fore again. Yeah, but that's a considerable time away.
Okay, I guess it depends on COVID recovery as well. So talking of legal questions, there was question in here which comes in, and this is from Daniel Jones, who recognises this is a bit of a niche question, but the Scottish Government manifesto committed to examining the dual role of the Lord Advocate, with the Lord Advocate, the current one, standing down. Will this be back up the agenda? And I'll start with you this time, Luke.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer, Daniel, to it. I think it is coming back up the agenda, as you said. There were, the issues around the salmon inquiry and the role of Lord Advocate in that, and looking at the splitting of it. Really, it's not my area of expertise, this legal thing, but I think it fits into a wider narrative of whether or not the institutions in and around the Scottish Parliament need to be re-examined, in the sense that, do they have proper divisions of power? Do they have proper ability to scrutinize, i.e. at committee level? So I think it feeds into the wider debate, but I don't know, Mandy, if you have thoughts on.
Thanks, Luke. I guess there is the opportunity right now. I mean, we're going to be hearing in the next few days who the replacement might be. I mean, I would base this, I guess, I did an interview with Lord Faulkner, Shadow Solicitor General, who's a Scottish advocate as it happens, but he was very damning about the Lord Advocate and the way he felt the Lord Advocate's role had become so close to government, and said that was dangerous for us all. I think Luke's right that the the various issues around the salmon inquiry perhaps shone a light on that and made people start questioning the independence of the Lord Advocate. So whether it's a perception or a reality, but there's an opportunity right now with a change of the Solicitor General and the Lord Advocate to rethink it.
Now, from my memory, going back right to the beginning of the Parliament, Scottish Parliament, this has been an issue that's raised its head as it becomes, as the role of the Lord Advocate becomes more important. Do you think, Kirsty, do you think they will finally go for this, try and change it?
I mean, I definitely think it needs examination. Whether how quickly the First Minister wants to get back into some of the issues that dogged her through the kind of earlier part of the year. But this is, I think what's interesting about justice and the whole area of law is it has moved at a different pace from devolution itself. So the Parliament came along in '99. There was reckoned to be about 20 years of Law Commission reports and recommendations just sort of sitting, waiting for legislative time, which clearly it wasn't, you know, and Scottish legislation was so sort of limited at Westminster. So there was this, you know, the Parliament arrived with this sort of menu of legal reforms to sort of pick up and sort of run with. But actually it seems to me that you know, sometimes the sort of justice changes that the Parliament and government are sort of talking about are either highly controversial, like some of the stuff we've seen sort of recently around sort of football, sort of trans rights, sort of etc., or just deeply so just, you know, wouldn't break out of a fairly small Holyrood bubble because it's to do with just some of the more arcane aspects of judges and sentencing and the sort of criminal law. I mean, I think some interesting stuff coming up about sort of victims' rights and sort of other things sort of in manifestos sort of this year. And I think, you know, in a sense that the SNP have to use the opportunity of, you know, a referendum being further away, but, you know, the more changes they can make to the, you know, these big state institutions to make them look like they might or sort of could look within the powers that they have. And I think this is a nettle that they have to grasp over the next few years.
Modernisation. I'm going to roll a couple of questions into one here. They're on a very similar theme. Cameron Duck asks, what impact will a Green MSP being presiding officer mean for government/Parliament business? Does this hurt the Green Party's ability to influence government? And Derek's question is very much along the same lines, but he's highlighting the issue of the 64 votes each. Does this help the government? Does it hinder the government? Does it help the opposition? Does it hinder the opposition? So I'll start with you again, Mandy.
I think obviously Alison Johnson has now relinquished her party loyalties. Does it help or hinder the Green Party and their influence of government? The SNP don't hugely need the Greens. I mean, they're in a better position than they were back in 2016. I think what they will have to do is reach out to other parties to find agreement on other things. So I'm not sure Alison Johnson as a former Green MSP makes a huge impact on the Greens' ability, to be honest.
And what about the stagnation of Parliament? Is it, because I was trying to remember the other day, what does the presiding officer have to do if it's absolute stalemate? You know,
status quo.
Status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they still go with basically the government's position.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can move budgets through the first step. You can a presiding officer can vote in favour of pushing a budget from stage 1 to 2, but I think would vote down the budget at stage 3. Is that right?
Yes, I think they can advance until there is the last stage in which they would vote with the status quo. Mm-hmm. I think on the point of the Greens, it's interesting. I mean, there is a symbolic power for the Greens, you know, holding the presiding officer, the speakership of a national party within Europe. I mean, that has a symbolic importance. And the panel might correct me if I'm wrong here, but there is, in terms of the 64-64 split, with the Liberal Democrats losing one seat going to 4, they're no longer on the Parliamentary Business bureau, in which case the SNP has a working majority, I believe, even because the presiding officer, in which case, would vote with them, I believe. So I think the SNP does have more power over determining business than it did before, which is a bit of a whip's office kind of point, but it could be important in terms of their ability to get legislation through. But I think Mandy's right. I mean, the SNP could use the Greens, but they can also use other parties to get legislation through, and they have in the past, although other parties remain quite quiet about that because it doesn't necessarily suit their wider narrative. But yeah, the SNP is quite adept several terms in terms of governing as a minority government.
So they can pick and choose their partners as they go along.
And that's why they would have avoided a formal coalition, which was, a rumor in the run-up in the last several weeks. But they don't. I mean, effectively, the cost of that would far outweigh the benefit.
I mean, I think on the presiding officer point, John, I was just going to say, I think what was really interesting about it was that no party actually wanted to relinquish anybody. And I think, watching Patrick Harvey's face on the day that Alison Johnson became presiding officer was kind of indicative of how he might have felt about losing a Green MSP as well.
I thought you were going to say he was looking deeply envious of her position.
No.
Politicians don't do that. So, okay, we'll move on to the next question, and this is from Esther Black. And to what extent will the impact of COVID on public finances, including the tax base, affect the argument in favour of independence? Does discussion of public finances really resonate with voters? Okay, Luke, I'll talk to you first, ask you first.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I guess in terms of the public finances, I mean, today saw from the ONS that UK GDP borrowing is at 99%. And the point there is that there's going to be lots of money for the Scottish government because the UK government is borrowing at exceptionally high levels. So the ability to sort of understand the impact of COVID versus taxation is it's a difficult thing to do because there will be huge amounts of capital via the Barnett consequentials coming to the Scottish government. I thought it was quite interesting in the SNP manifesto. They always get some sort of middle class, so I always say friendly policies, and the income tax freeze, in line with inflation, was one of those policies. And I think the First Minister was questioned about it in one of the last televised debates, and she alluded to that, that was more of an aspiration than a rock solid policy. So I think in terms of the sort of pounds in the pocket argument, yeah, it does make a difference, but COVID will really distort the ability to analyze that, not least because you have furlough scheme promised until the end of September. And many people argue that you're really just putting off the pain until then in terms of larger amounts of unemployment. That's when we'll be able to feel the real full effects economically of COVID. Of course, the Chancellor could choose to extend it again, as he has many times.
Yes. Now, Kirsty, I was going to say that public finances, the biggest and hottest debate is usually around the GERS figures. And people tend to just fall down whichever side of the constitutional debate they're on. So are people going to, and then the other bit of this argument, which I suspect Esther is alluding to, is this whole debate about we're too wee, we're too small, we're too poor, we can't be independent. Is there any chance of a realistic discussion about public finances?
I suppose that the second part of Esther's question is probably no, a resounding no. But today I think there'll be a couple of interesting things. Not least, I think this morning the Daily Record got hold of a copy of the. So I'm just scrolling down to get the title right. The
Social justice.
The SNP's Social Justice and Fairness Commission report, which is now advocating the scrapping of sort of council tax. So I think the Scottish Government, the SNP, are very good. They're very good at the optics of this. It's about presenting, so there is, the challenge that they're somehow lacking in big ideas, I don't think is necessarily fair, but it's about the route map sort of from here to there, and they may use some sort of big some sort of big ideas sort of coming out of that.
Like scrapping the council tax.
Yeah, because that's something that voters will remember. It can be it can be sort of quickly sort of grabbed into a media headline, but they're not necessarily going to sort of, the voters are not sort of necessarily, they're going to want to know when do I need to start, when can I stop paying council tax, rather than what are the nuances of sort of tax bandings sort of here between sort of here and there. And I think there is a sense that some of the lines that we'll see sort of coming out of sort of Conservative Party about just the mobilisation of money, if the Scottish Government sort of essentially sort of get that wrong, or it kind of looks sort of difficult. Again, this is sort of essentially splitting Scotland in half, because there's a massive part of the population who don't have the ability to sort of pick up sticks, sort of move to the lowest tax sort of part of the UK. So again, these things will chime depending on which segment of society that you're speaking to.
But presumably, Mandy, if they do this, and it is just a suggestion at this stage, is that if the council tax would be scrapped, people aren't going to get away with it for free. Somebody's going to have to pay some tax somewhere.
I think it's interesting, both from Kirsty and Luke, that we're kind of looking at two things. We're looking at the UK economy looking very difficult, but with lots of money sloshing around, as Luke says, because borrowing rates are so low. So while people are feeling insecure at the moment, I think there's because all this comes back to the constitutional question, the UK government will be able to absolutely play into, would an independent Scotland have been able to provide a furlough scheme? Would they have been able to help businesses out in the way that the UK money had? I mean, it will still divide on those things. So while a council tax, or an abolishing of the council tax, which the Greens would be very happy about, for instance, will play into an immediate feel-good factor, there's a much wider issue about how the economy sits. And I think everyone's aware that probably the SNP or the Yes movement lost the last referendum on the economics. And at the moment, it's the one area that Nicola Sturgeon visibly looks uncomfortable with, that she doesn't deal with very well. There isn't a good economic proposition at the moment, and that work needs to happen.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. What's the significance of the cabinet reshuffle in moving people such as Shona Robertson to a responsibility for housing and planning? Does her experience in health, for example, show that the Scottish Government is now viewing housing and homelessness as a public health issue? Luke.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. The cabinet overall, you could, some new faces, some people returning, like Shona, for instance. You could argue that, it's sort of steady as she goes. But what's more interesting, and what this question is asking, is around prioritization within portfolio. And definitely, you can infer, or you could guess what has become more or less important. And I think that housing, Kevin Stewart's job's abolished as housing minister, and that goes straight up to Shona's portfolio at CabSec level. That is something worth observing. Not least that they have a very big promise of 100,000 houses to build, but also issues around fire safety and cladding and other things that have been rumbling on in the housing. So I think that's quite interesting too. And of course, just looking at other portfolios, the combination effectively of a chancellor role with a business secretary in Kate Forbes is a big merger. Although, I mean, it is slightly reverting to what was before, but you can kind of see then where, what the importance is. And of course, if you look at drugs death, for instance, Angela Constance reports directly to the First Minister. So if you look at the portfolio swapping, you can maybe guess that X is more important than Y, but definitely on housing for sure. I think that's an indication of how serious Nicola's going to take the issue of housing and homelessness.
Yeah, and I'm just going to roll this into the next question as well, because aside from independence and COVID, and remembering the previous question about housing, what do you think, Kirsty, will be the key issues for the next 5 years? So you're leaving independence, leaving COVID, but maintaining housing, and what else?
Yeah, I mean, most immediately education. I mean, Shirley, what a job to come into for Shirley Ann Somerville. You're literally sort of right in the midst of or what should have been the summer exams diet, but is obviously sort of is both sort of less than that, but actually all too alike it sort of for a number sort of parents there. I mean, the intake is it's a refresh. These are people that know each other well. There'll be a kind of collegiate sort of sense among sort of particularly the cabinet. But there's for me, there's a real sort of, there's a safe loyalty sort of going on in the appointments there, and it'll be interesting. I don't think any of this freshness necessarily changes where the heart of decision making is going to be, and I don't necessarily see a widening of that sort of inner circle. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how particularly in the ministerial ranks, kind of how some of the newer names can do this, and obviously, for me, what's interesting about it is just the risk in policy making has always been just a real sort of fascination, and clearly while there's all the constitutional sort of game playing out, then they'll be sort of doing everything to prevent that. And the other thing I would say is that on...
Sorry, Kirsty, to jump in, what do you mean by there'll be no widening of the decision making?
I think Nicholas Sturgeon is just, I spoke to in the 2018 reshuffle, I spoke to somebody who had come into sort of ministerial role for the first time, and we were having breakfast together, and they said to me, the idea that I'm any closer to decision making today as I was yesterday is just the biggest. I think I said, you've been in the job a couple of days now. What was the most surprising thing? And he just, that was the sense that you're.
Okay.
And I think, we do a lot of work around public sector Scotland, and there's a lot of control over, agency announcements, through sort of sponsoring sort of departments. So there's a grip both on sort of decision making from sort of within the sort of First Minister's sort of closest sort of aides and confidants, but it's also within the sort of civil service in terms of how it's playing out to agencies. Agencies are not necessarily getting told, here's your budget, go change Scotland, and tell us when you kind of hit on an issue. It's being kind of very carefully managed. So when you're setting up a new national care service, and that's some really interesting, in terms of what issues we've got, not proven verdicts, we've got national care service, we've got cross-party concern about drug deaths, as Mandy already mentioned. And I suppose that's the interesting thing, is that manifestos, it's a 16-word pledge in a manifesto, where you can see the coming together of parties. This is a good idea, but actually, once vested interests, start to, and there'll be representatives of those interests, and none sort of on the call today. But once that sort of influencing and actually, what does this mean for our sector and for our industry? Then it'll be interesting to see how much of that commonality of goal starts to fall away. And that's where, for me, the committee setup gets interesting, because you will still have the SNP in a minority position on every parliamentary sort of committee, because the D'Hondt principle, the principle of proportionality is I think, I'm sort of checking with parliamentary officials, there's my understanding that committees will be formed based on the proportionality of the day of the election results, not since Alison Johnson became presiding officer. So
okay.
that.
Mandy, just very quickly, can you just sum up what you see as the priorities?
Health.
Leaving independence and COVID out.
Yeah. I mean, health and the backlog of particular cancer waiting times. I think that those are the things that are really affecting lots of people right now. Education, as Kirsty says, I think that a light has been shone on that. When a First Minister says, test me on closing the attainment gap, and fails to do that, but still gets elected on a very large mandate and becomes the First Minister, does she continue to say test me on education, or is that forgotten about because that was for the last session? But I think the immediate impact for lots of people on health waiting times will be something. I mean, just going back to what Kirsty and Luke were saying, this cabinet there's been a lot of criticism about a rehashing of old characters. I think Nicola Sturgeon would probably have done a reshuffle had there not been a pandemic. So you'd have had more people coming through the ranks, getting ministerial experience and then moving up a bit. So, that was kind of out with her control. I think bringing back Shona Robeson is a good move, and it's her social justice, the report that's coming out today. Social justice is very much at her core, and bringing Keith Brown into justice. I always felt quite sad that Keith Brown had left cabinet. I think he's a good solid operator. And Michael Matheson being given that zero carbon role is really important as well with COP26. So I don't share the criticism of it being a kind of stale rehash of old people. I think there's some good experience around the table, but it also highlighted a very poor succession plan. And I think that's something that has to be looked at for the future. Who are the people that are coming up? How do they get the experience? Who could the next First Minister be?
Okay. Talking of a past First Minister, with the failure of ASPA, is social conservatism a failed ideology in the Scottish independence movement? Has it proved ineffective for persuading new yes voters? So if I keep this one fairly brief. Luke, do you want to start?
Yeah, if you define their movement as socially conservative, I just think overall the experiment was a disaster. They're blaming the fact that they started later on in this process and blah 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 blah. But getting 600 votes and first past post or on the list in regions is catastrophic. So I don't think it's a failure, particularly social conservatism, but it as a way to split the wider yes movement, it was an abject failure. Where there was tactical voting on that side of the coin, it was very much the Green Party.
Okay, Kirsty, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at both, to broaden that out, both Alex Salmond's, sort of George Galloway, even sort of Lawrence Fox, sort of bid sort of further south, just generally a sort of a failure of these sort of, I don't know, just the kind of anti, kind of like just a kind of anti movement. I think the Greens will look more carefully at who's on the ballot and how they're displaying their logos sort of next time, because it's clearly, I think they are right to be sort of frustrated at some of the sort of voting numbers, and there are people sort of better at sort of crafting these numbers and sort of looking at the vote. But essentially there is a substantive sort of SNP/Green sort of voting block out there.
Clearly, ASPA wasn't very effective. What's your view on it? Watching it, Mandy, why did ASPA not cut through?
I think the messenger. So, I mean, I think what's interesting about it was the message about the regional list and the importance of the regional list. I think if ASPA had any success at all, it was just highlighting that issue and the importance of the list vote for many voters. And I think people will think about that going forward. I think that was the success of what he did. The messenger clearly was not the right thing. But I think if you're talking about failed socially conservative policies, the main opposition is the Scottish Conservative Party. So yes. I wouldn't necessarily say socially conservative politics failed.
Yeah, the Scottish Conservatives are arguably the biggest beneficiary of the ASPA messaging. I can't remember who said it, but was it if any voter was in any doubt that this ballot was all about independence, then they had Douglas Ross popping up every 5 seconds to remind them. And Ruth Davidson holding peach vote Tory, in the latter days of the campaign. Apart from the fact it doesn't really scan, but
Yes, but this brings me to a question. I'm going to just put my own question in here, because this is something I am asked regularly. Why do people in such huge numbers vote SNP? Does it come down simply, Mandy, to independence? Is it the constitutional thing? Is it the record in government? Is it loyalty to Nicola Sturgeon, who has managed to kind of increase her popularity and also stay in front of the audience during COVID? Is it all these things, or is it a combination?
I think it's all of those things and a combination. I mean, I think undoubtedly Nicola Sturgeon is one of the most polished and accomplished politicians of our generation. I mean, I think sometimes it's about familiarity breeds contempt in Scotland, and we're a bit about tall poppies, etc. When she is compared with Boris Johnson, she absolutely benefits, from her incumbency, but her presentation around the pandemic was so much more assured, so much more empathetic. The results may not have been very different, but she definitely came over better. People, I guess, vote for independence because they want the SNP because they want independence, and they want independence for different reasons. So it's for lots of different reasons. But she, as the person that fronts that, she's an incredible asset.
A good front person. Luke?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, it's a very good question, but I think what's interesting with Nicola Sturgeon, obviously, as Mandy said, her favorability ratings are very high, but there's also quite a bit of churn in who supports SNP and Yes. And the biggest thing that you have to note with Nicola is that independence for decades was a male-dominated pursuit. It's not anymore. It's flipped, and that obviously has related into SNP votes as well. And some people say that COVID, there's a lot of talk by opposition parties that the pandemic gave Nicola Sturgeon a platform, and undoubtedly it did. And the message about how strong leadership during these serious times cut through. But the SNP was polling better before the COVID pandemic, so it doesn't really put paid to that. And the last point, which is really interesting for me, is that yes, the simple analysis would suggest that those who support Yes vote SNP, therefore it's 50%, and that's what the support for Yes in the polls as well. But if you look at the trust on issues, so it's who do you trust most to take care of the economy, education, health? Generally speaking, the SNP, after 3 full terms of government, polls 2-1. So when it comes to the crunch on those issues, people still believe the SNP is best. And I think that strength and record in government is probably the backbone of a lot of the SNP votes in general elections.
Or is it, Kirsty, all these factors, and I've just thought of another one, is it the impotence of the opposition as well? You can chuck that in as a factor.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about people burling in their grave, but if you told some of the devolution's founding fathers that in 2021 we'd have an election with only one party leaders actually running to be First Minister, so there is once you sort of fall behind so far, then that's the challenge of sort of essentially sort of getting sort of back in the park. And as I sort of like to put it, for me, Scottish Labour spent so much of the last session sort of picking up the ball in the middle of the park and then just running to 4 safe corners on policy. And at least I feel like Analyse is playing the ball in the midfield sort of thing, and he might be sort of lacking kind of players and sort of possession.
Okay,
but, at
just
least
thing you mentioned him, Kirsty. I'm going to move quickly to the next question. Do you think he needs to change his positioning on the independence question in order to begin a comeback for Labour?
I mean, that's got to be one of the sort of biggest sort of dilemmas in Scottish politics sort of right now. Is I don't think he can sort of realistically. I think we know that sort of Scottish Labour is, in terms of the membership, is there's probably a substantial sort of minority who we had, I think, candidates expressing sort of as much there, but looking towards, as Mandy says, looking towards the relative immediacy of the next UK election. We all sort of remember the sort of UK Labour leader with sort of SNP sort of in their pocket. So we have to sort of think about if the next significant campaign is a kind of UK sort of general election, then I think there would be, there would be a lot of there would be a big issue for him to change that now. The other thing, just sort of quickly on sort of voting and how this plays, is sort of 900,000 voters down on IndyRef 2014 to 2021 election, and there's also kind of fascination for me of who are those 900,000 who voted in 2014 but didn't vote 2 weeks ago, and what are their issues in politics.
Well, where would they go? That's a very good question, actually. Luke, you didn't advise the Labour Party at any point in your life, I don't think. What would your advice to Anas Sarwar be?
Well, to continue in the same vein that he is, not I thought he had an excellent campaign, presentationally and optically. I think the challenge for him is that he was elected leader quite late on in the process. I think his messaging around being very reasonable and sort of positioning himself between two bickering groups on either side of the constitutional issue, and sort of that COVID must be the recovery is a strong line to take in opposition. But to your original question, what is the position that Labour takes if it wants to change positions? I mean, is it going to yet again, flirt with a federalism a la Gordon Brown's countless interventions on this? What is it? That's the real difficulty. Now, is there space to have a nuanced position for greater devolution? And yes, I guess, but it's the same Democrats. That's been their kind of policy realm for a very, very long time, but it's not tangible to people. And people understand the independence question now as a binary yes or no. But I think there's a real opportunity for Labour in this term to refine policy, come up with some of those ideas, challenge government in a constructive way, to be seen as kind of the constructive opposition as opposed to the very bitter, potentially negative opposition of the Conservative Party. So I think it's definitely something to watch how that evolves.
Okay.
The polling was super close.
Yeah, and in terms of the independence question, do you think that is key, Mandy, for a Labour comeback? Or, as Luke is saying, do they have to show themselves to be an effective opposition?
I don't think the independence question has to figure large right now, because it's all in the timing, as we said. So if a general election comes before a referendum, absolutely not. Don't go near it. I mean, my advice to Anas Sarwar, he's very good. He's very polished. He's a lot of money's been spent on getting him to that point of being a very good communicator. He needs to start having more depth, more policy, flying some kites, and using that position as Labour leader to say, this is how we would do something very differently. So use your reasonable position, but start showing the SNP government how you would create a social justice agenda.
Okay.
And that's maybe the hope for the new Labour intake, is there probably are some kite flyers. There was an awful lot of spear carriers in the last parliamentary group, I think.
There's some really good talent, and that's the thing. I think there's some, both in the Tory party and in the Labour Party, there's some really good MSPs that have come in with really, good hinterlands, that could contribute a lot.
And this is what Anas needs to learn from. The Scottish Conservatives are already saying we've got 15 bills planned for the next 4 to 5 years. So they're talking like legislators. But are only sort of 8-9 seats sort of ahead in terms of parliamentary group, and so Anas has to close the terminology gap as well. I think the next Scottish election seems so far off, but it will be gone in the blink of an eye. So he has to kind of almost start now, sort of talking like an official opposition or
yeah. Okay, not surprisingly, John Edward comes in with a question about Europe. Will the Scottish Government have to confront the reality that EU re-entry, the substantive change that creates the argument for IndyRef 2, faces opposition from various sources on common fisheries policy, on the euro versus the pound, free movement, and the 1 million Scottish leavers? Mandy, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked a lot about the fact that a large number of SNP supporters voted to leave, But the bottom line is they would still be independence supporters. So they're not going to leave the independence campaign. But I think in terms of the narrative, I guess the party has to become much more sophisticated about saying what could happen rather than they just assume we'll be back into Europe, because that it isn't going to be as easy as that. Maybe they need to start talking about joining EFTA or just having a different narrative. But the assumption that all of Scotland wants back into Europe has to be addressed, I guess. Although it's not helping the Tory party, clearly, that they went into the EU referendum saying that they would be the friends of farmers and fishermen, and we're now in this dreadful situation.
Okay, Luke.
Yeah, I think there's this issue, John, or the issues around it will be definitely a part of a renewed prospectus on independence. And I think, as Mandy said, nuanced, perhaps more open about the challenges and timescales involved in this as well. Obviously, there is a material change, so they're applying from without, like any other member state. So I do think that there needs to be a lot of work put into that and some realism around time scales on that as a starter.
And when you say realism, Luke, what do you mean? Are we talking
well, just versus
5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years before?
I don't know that. I mean, you could say that convergence criteria, that obviously Scotland would meet a lot of it, and the Scottish government would desire to keep policies that are as close to the EU as possible. So when on timescales, I don't know, John, but I think just going from a position of relative automaticity to EU membership to one where you're applying like any other new member state is going to mean a longer, more complicated process.
Okay, got another couple of questions, but Kirsty, I'll come to you on that. So, how much of an issue is Europe?
Yeah, well, that's where 2014 does seem like a sort of different sort of world away. The prospectus we had then was keep all the things you like and get rid of all the things you don't. I mean, that's now with Brexit, that's just a sort of a massive, it's just a potentially massive trap, sort of for the SNP. The public finances in 2014 were sort of arguably quite good. There's the sort of potential will be. The question for me is, will we be realistically talking about kind of European re-entry, or before we stop talking about Scotland's economy in the terms of its, the dollars per barrel of oil sort of thing? Which one of those two things could realistically happen first? Because we're still quite locked in, in some of that sort of, what I guess we kind of hope will be kind of, old terminology and sort of old thinking, but even just looking back a matter of weeks, then sort of, currency sort of border, it really all needs, and that is the double challenge of the pandemic, is we need to recover for this, but yet it has changed. Even those documents that were refreshed since 2014, it has now sort of pulled the rug from under.
Okay, Luke, did you want to come in there?
It's actually quite interesting, and there's not a lot of fidelity on it at the moment in terms of the detail, but if you look at the SNP manifesto, there's a lot of commitments to start like a new Scottish food agency, pharmaceutical agency, national infrastructure company. And some of those things will be to replicate functions that the EU had done previously. So if you think about A, it's a huge challenge for the civil service, but B, once those institutions are in place, then they exist. And then it's, well, actually we would abolish them or change their duties considerably to rejoin the EU. And I think there's a process and resource issue there that it hasn't really come to the fore, but I think it will once they start putting down the legislation to create these different agencies and bodies.
Okay, right, we're down to the last couple of questions, and I've just seen the one I'm going to finish with, so I'm going to pull a couple together. On education, is there realistically anything the CABSEC can do in one term? That's from John Edward. We've got a new CABSEC on education. And the OECD education report, this one is from Derek Young, we'll put them together. When it's published, it's likely to say that we've done some good things on personal well-being, resilience, global citizenship, but are doing comparatively worse on core subjects. Will the government and the Parliament be brave enough to make drastic changes to something when they're so invested in curriculum for excellence? So I'll start with you, Luke, on this one.
Yeah, geez, I mean, the report's been delayed, and now, you know, it's a huge challenge. And to John's point, like, is there enough time in this term? But the report, you know, very soon. And I think, given other events that are going on at the moment, there is an opportunity perhaps for, you know, a big mea culpa, in the sense that, you know, we got this wrong, and invite others on a cross-party basis to have a much more direct input into this as a political way forward. But that's just a guess for me. It's a huge challenge.
And do you think, Mandy, there's a chance with a new education secretary, you can actually say that was then, this is now, this is the way forward, and we start from what the OECD report says?
I guess it's such a huge challenge, and it goes back to what I was saying about kite flying. I'd like to see some new ideas about how we deliver education. And I think in a country our size, why do we have 32 local authorities delivering education? I mean, maybe there's a moment in time to start thinking, do we want to deliver education on a national level? I just, you know, I probably, this is not my comfort zone particularly, but we seem to have been talking about how we improve education for so long now. Something new needs to happen. I'm just not sure what it is. Everything seems to get sent back to a citizens' assembly. I think that's going to be the new mantra these days.
It's a bit unfair on the citizens when people put them forward, forward an election to
elect your politicians, but ask the people.
Yes, to run the country. Kirsty.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke earlier about a sense that some sort of government agencies you know, are kind of almost just sort of straining at the leash a little bit and just kind of want set loose. I mean, on the other hand, it's hard to think of an agency that is less like that than Education Scotland. They're just invisible on the debate. I think they've left the SQA massively exposed. And while I would, you know, clearly there are perhaps some sort of questions to be answered at somebody's door, just in terms of sort of what's been happening over the kind of exams, then education is, you know, clearly, you know, for that cohort and group, there's some sort of fairly significant questions that need asked. But I just think this agency are sort of invisible and allowed a lot of these parent groups that sprung up during lockdown to really sort of own that education debate, and they just simply weren't engaging on sort of issues like the, you know, sort of cross Scotland sort of school. John knows the independent sector very well. You know, they were sort of leading from the front. Parents were asking questions about where the state provision was, and they were just found very lacking.
Can I just say, ask the question, is it fair to blame the SQA and the Education Scotland? Should they not be given political leadership?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally, I think curriculum for excellence is a good thing, but I think
everybody seems to say it is, but it doesn't seem to be working.
It was a new coat thrown on. It was a new tablecloth thrown on a table that, you know, still had the kind of shall we say, the sort of the wonky leg, and it, you know, it has sort of been exposed, you know, because actually you've got to. You know, and I think the teaching profession are not necessarily or weren't originally sort of opposed to this thing. It took the way that progressive teachers taught and tried to sort of bring everyone kind of along, but actually it lost its way.
Anybody else? Okay, right, we're going to now move. We've just come almost to the end, but I've seen a question, and there is no suggestion that this is likely to happen, but it will happen at some stage. It's not going to happen soon, I think. Is who would be the next First Minister if Nicola Sturgeon were to stand down? Mandy.
If it happened tomorrow, John Swinney. I don't know. I mean, we all come up with the same name. So Kate Forbes is clearly in a strong position. Humza's name gets mentioned a lot. Angus has just come into the cabinet. I think it's actually a poor reflection on Nicola Sturgeon that we struggle to say who would be the next First Minister. If you'd asked us this when Alex Salmond was First Minister, there was no question of who the next First Minister would be. So I think for a leader, succession planning is really important. We probably all think about what would happen if something happened to any of us. So I wish we didn't struggle with it. I think Kate is an incredibly talented woman. She's in a great position. She picked up that ball and ran with it when she needed to. I think on a personal level, she would worry about the way that she can be criticised about her own faith, which becomes an issue when perhaps it shouldn't. Yeah, I'd probably leave it. I mean, there are people that I rate that nobody else ever mentions. People like Michael Matheson and Keith Brown, people that I think are very talented but haven't been to the fore.
Okay, so you're leaving it open. Luke.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm just going to take the coward's way out and say the same three names, basically. I'm not going to offer any fresh views. You could be slightly not conspiratorial, but you could be like slightly wicked in your thoughts that the portfolios that those three have all are quite challenging, and this is some sort of Hunger Games type scenario to see who comes through in terms of succession. But yeah, I mean, Mandy is right. Obviously, when Alex Salmond was First Minister, it was obvious. But there is a full parliamentary term to get that in place. So yeah, I think we'll wait and see. But politics has a great way of surprising us all. And I think this term will be, I hate the word unprecedented, but there's just going to be so many massive things to deal with that the changes of personal political fortunes will be huge.
Okay, Kirsty, finally.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just hope for a healthy competition. I think the manner in which Kate came into her most recent role and sort of stepped up in that moment shows to us the danger of trying to anoint your successor, because we all know sort of what happened to him. So yeah, I think it's in the nature of politicians to try and prepare the way for the favoured one, but I think as observers of it, we want a few names in the hat.
Yeah, we want a race, want competition. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our hour. Thank you very much. I know we can't really give them a round of applause, but a virtual round of applause for our panel, Mandy Rhodes, Luke Skipper and Kirsty Peebles. You've been really excellent. Thank you as well for some really good questions.